Bim Afolami, welcome to the podcast and thanks so much for coming on Acting Prime Minister.
No problem at all.
How was your latest lockdown weekend?
Busy, out and about, seeing lots of friends, parties and stuff. That's a joke. I want to be clear.
I almost believed that for a minute. I thought that was quite a good story for a minute. I was like, hang on a minute.
I'm being very clear. I was joking. No, what was I doing? I was, we live just outside a village in Hertfordshire and playing in the snow with the boys, going down toboggans at home and that sort of thing. And
at least the snow provided some novelty this weekend, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It broke the malaise.
The boys were very, very, very happy with. So that was that, alongside my normal diet of reading lots of history books and watching Netflix. And
I mean, what else is there to do?
Quite.
Well, look, there wasn't much snow in central London this week in Downing Street, but we're going to put you in there regardless. And we always like to get our guests settled into number 10 to imagine themselves as Prime Minister for a moment. So first things first, what is the personal item that you would take from home with you as Prime Minister, do you think?
Well, in addition to various of my favourite books, in particular Robert Caro's series on Lyndon Johnson, which I realise is a bit of a political cliche, but it really is a brilliant series of books. In addition to sort of hundreds of books, it is probably, and I'm going to steal this from my father-in-law, who has this brilliant bust of Nelson in his hallway. And so I think I would take that in, definitely.
Everyone loves a bust, don't they? I mean, the Churchill bust is back on the agenda in the White House.
Oh, I know.
It's just people are obsessed with busts.
Yeah, I mean, the Churchill bust argument, I mean, I don't know, I'll probably get shot saying this, but I do think we need to be a little bit less needy as a nation. Churchill was a great man. I've literally read almost everything I can find about him. What an interesting person, the savior of Western civilization in many respects. But, let's not have a go at every American president every time they want to put somebody else up in the Oval Office.
Of course, this is the row over whether the bust should be put back in the White House. I think it was Obama, right, who took the bust out of the White House, and it became a bit of a thing. Anyway, who's the first person you would want to call as Prime Minister? Because you can phone anyone you want in the world.
I would probably, after all these sort of obvious, statesman calls, you'd have to call the President of the United States and the French President, the German Chancellor, all those people. So you've got to do them first, because that's really important, obviously. But I suppose the first fun call I would make is probably to my mother, who would just think it was hilarious. And she would think that probably somebody was joking and that, the period of time where I'd been made Prime Minister was a dream of some description. Probably to my mother. And then probably to a bunch of favourite musicians. Because I think that one thing that we don't do enough in political leadership in this country, not just the Prime Minister, but other senior positions, is highlighting the cultural success of this country. I think we should get, and not just classical music, I'd get Taylor Swift in, I'd get Jay-Z in, I'd get Harry Styles and One Direction in, I would get pop culture into Downing Street. Because, you know what? They are some of our most successful exports as a nation, and they give a bit of joy, a bit of life. And why shouldn't our political leaders champion them just as much as we champion authors or artists and this sort of thing?
A very Tony Blair thing to do. And of course, musicians do feel a bit down on their luck at the moment because of COVID. Number one, they can't go around touring and they haven't had a lot of money from the government necessarily. They're not able to access furlough, and also Brexit. They're worried about being able to go touring around Europe at the moment. Do you think that maybe the government should be making musicians a bit more of a priority?
I think we should make musicians, and not just musicians actually, but just the creative sector more generally, a big priority for this country. We always think of our exports, and when people think of exports, they think of people in factories churning out cars or whatever. Now, of course, cars and factories are very important, but actually, our creative sector, our music, our art, our plays, our ability to make films, the James Bond franchise, all of these things are actually some of our most successful exports, and actually give Britain that thing soft power. That is what gives us our reach across the globe. And so not only should we make them a priority, but we should see them not just in terms of life in life enriching terms, but we should see them as ways of improving our economy. You know, if our creative sector is successful, Britain will be successful. I think we need to champion them.
Okay, and what would your first meal be in Downing Street? Have you got a favourite sort of go-to comfort food?
Well, any of my friends listening to this will find this very amusing, because they will definitely call me out on Twitter or something if I wasn't very honest about my favourite meal, which is undoubtedly spaghetti bolognese. So I would definitely have that.
Excellent. And look, you mentioned that obviously you'd call the American president, and we've got a new president now, President Biden. What do you think you would have said to him in that phone call that the Prime Minister had this weekend, if you'd been in his shoes?
In short, thank goodness. And you won't agree on everything, but you will agree on the importance of democracy not being, the image of democracy not being trashed all over the world. And I think that's definitely something that Biden will do, though I'm sure he'll do things that, you know, as a conservative, I probably think are too left wing, but broadly speaking, he seems like a very decent man with a good career who understands politics at the very highest level. And I think we're lucky to have him in the White House at this time.
But you've been quite honest about your views on President Trump, because you tweeted.
Oh, have I? Oh no.
Yeah. Well, no, not. You know, you've just been upfront about it. You said that he's been a cancer at the heart of US politics around the time when people were storming the Capitol.
Yeah.
So how did you feel when President Biden, you know, was finally sworn in?
Well, as I say, just relieved. But more broadly, I think what we saw at the inauguration was the American political establishment of both the Republicans and the Democrats trying to draw a line under the Trump era. I think that's very important. And that isn't about ideology. You know, frankly, I don't know how much George W. Bush and Barack Obama, for example, agree on policy questions. But I do think that a broad set of norms and a broadly shared series of facts is pretty important in America as much as it is in this country. And so I think that was a very unifying moment, for me at least.
Had you started to feel quite uncomfortable then as a member of the British government doing business with Donald Trump?
Well, the truth is you have to do business with whoever is the US president, a bit like there are leaders all over the world that should make everybody feel uncomfortable. You know, I'd feel pretty uncomfortable dealing with the Iranian regime. I'd feel pretty uncomfortable dealing with certain countries in the Middle East with certain backwards laws to do with, I don't know, to do with women or homosexual relationships or various other things. So I think in international relations, you have to deal with all sorts of people. The question is, you've got to make sure you do that in a way that the public can see that you've got your own red lines. And I think actually with Trump, we did that very well. You know, on climate agenda, for example, we didn't say, oh, well, Donald Trump doesn't like our climate change agenda, so we're not going to do anything. We just pressed ahead without him and worked with other countries. I think that's a good way of operating.
I mean, some people have accused Boris Johnson of being a bit too close to Donald Trump, though, and sometimes borrowing from his sort of playbook of politics. I just wonder whether, as someone who is on the more sort of liberal wing of the party, although we'll talk about your politics in a moment, you can define yourself however you want to. I just wonder whether that made you feel a little bit uncomfortable at times.
No, I just think that what we saw over the last 4 or 5 years, was just a period of time in Western democracy that I think had come out of the aftermath of the financial crisis, 2008-9. It reached its culmination in this country with Brexit vote, in the US with the election of Trump. And though by no means some of the things that led to those things have gone away, I do think we're at a more settled period of time now. And to answer your question very directly, I think actually the Prime Minister has handled a sticky wicket pretty well, because what he's managed to do and what the Conservative Party under his leadership has managed to do is effectively incorporate that need for that very clearly democratic vote of the Brexit referendum that obviously annoyed, you know, lots of people on the other side who lost the argument, but at the same time incorporate that within a structure that is sane, sensible, and believes in good government. And actually to be able to incorporate that and not to allow it to blow up our political system is, I think, a real achievement.
Okay, well, let's talk about you again now. And let's talk
about me.
Let's talk about you, which everyone likes to talk about themselves. Let's talk about your path to power as Prime Minister, because remember, you're Prime Minister now.
Haven't got any.
No, but you're Prime Minister now, don't forget.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So you were born in Berkshire a year after I was, which slightly pains me. Your father was a Nigerian doctor in the NHS. He'd arrived in the UK. Still is. And he'd arrived in the UK in his early 20s. Your mother was or is a pharmacist?
Yeah, both still are.
Yeah. You attended Eton and then Oxford before becoming a corporate lawyer. But as someone who's always been interested in politics, it wasn't long before you were elected as Conservative MP for Hitchin and Harpenden in 2017. And you're now also an aide to the Work and Pensions Secretary, Therese Coffey. So, firstly, I want to talk to you about something that you have wanted to talk about yourself, which is, as a son of a black immigrant from Africa, how did you end up becoming a Conservative? Because people do kind of level that at you, don't they? And they ask you that, which can be a little bit frustrating for you at times.
Yes. It's a good question, though, because, look, I'm 34, almost 35. When I was younger, even until, really the end of my teens, there was not a Conservative MP that wasn't white. So, things feel and look very, very different now, as everybody listening to this will appreciate. But it was weirder to be, non-white, in particular black, and being Conservative when I was much younger. But I've always felt that, and I think you're starting to see this now coming through the Conservative Party, not just in MPs, but also with support as well, that your typical small p political views of a lot of immigrant families like my own are actually very conservative. In some social ways, more socially conservative than the Conservative Party is. So tend to be very strong belief in work, a very strong belief in the foundation of family and marriage as a bedrock of society, a very strong belief in entrepreneurship and the private sector, a very strong belief in education and working hard to get ahead, and various other things that I think most conservatives would think are, broadly speaking, conservative values. That's not now the reason why a lot of people who look like me and from my background until fairly recently didn't vote Conservative, I think was a legacy of the 70s, in particular 60s and 70s, Enoch Powell and all of that. Mm-hmm. And those things have a long sort of cast a long shadow. But I do think things have changed hugely. I do credit David Cameron in particular with changing the face of the party a lot. And Boris Johnson has continued to do that with people who've come in under his leadership.
Have you had people in your family and maybe your broader friendship group who've said to you, we can't believe you're a Conservative? It does surprise us that you're a Conservative.
In my family, there's a pretty wide range of views, ranging from the Corbynese left to the Farage right. Not my own close nuclear family, might I add. I'll be very honest, and you alluded to it. I did go. My parents, are professionals. I went to Eton College, then Oxford, and if you hadn't mentioned my name, and you were just describing me, I suspect a lot of listeners wouldn't have thought that was particularly unusual that I became a Conservative MP. So it does give you a slightly weird mixture of influences and perspectives, which I think is a strength in politics, though when you're younger, it can almost be slightly more confusing. But no, I think that I've always been a pretty conservative sort of guy. The thing that I do think, though, now looking forward, and what I say to young people when I meet them, when I speak to them about politics and the Conservative Party, is you've got to look past Brexit in particular. Brexit was an event, but it doesn't define the raison d'etre of the Conservative Party. And that means, by the way, even if you're very pro-Brexit, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually, believe in everything the Conservative Party does. And of course, if you're very anti-Brexit, I would say that we've got to look forward and make sure we make the best of everything. So I think that Brexit has been that sort of almost firebreak in our political culture and political opinion that I don't think is helpful over the long term for us to continue looking through the prism of. We've got to now look forward, and all parties, left, right, and everything, needs to say, how can we best position our country in the 21st century?
I'm just really interested in this kind of conflict between identities that some politicians sort of feel. I mean, I wonder whether, for example, you identified at all with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke a bit about this at the time. I think that you can believe, as I do, and I'm sure you do, that Black Lives Matter and all lives have equal value. And at the same time, not necessarily agree with a particular type of very left-wing, slightly anarchist way of viewing sort of policy. And that's my view on it. The thing that frustrated me at that time, and I wrote about this at the time, was, and I spoke about it in the House of Commons, was the people who I've come across who were actually more, in my view, backward-looking in terms of their view of my race and my politics, were not right-wing conservatives, were actually not people on the sort of left wing of the Labour Party. They were, what I like to describe as just sort of centre-left sort of soggy liberals, who, a lot of whom could not compute the idea that a black person was a conservative, and therefore sought to suggest that you couldn't really understand what you were doing and you were being used by some greater power, and would literally say these things to me and would write them. And that, I thought, was particularly odd, because I think it's also tinged with class prejudice as well. It's the idea that, well, we're a particularly well-educated group with a particular status in society, and it's our job to look after black people and make sure we make their decisions for them. And I think that sort of attitude is something that I push back very hard against. And as I say, I was very clear about this in the House of Commons and in print as well.
There's just this whole culture clash, isn't there, at the heart of politics at the moment? I mean, would you take the knee, for example? Because that became this sort of majorly defining question in politics in terms of who you sided with. Were you woke, or were you kind of anti-woke? Were you pro Black Lives Matter or anti-Black Lives Matter? I mean,
I didn't take the knee because I don't, and this is where you'll see my sort of real conservatism coming out. I don't believe in this slightly modern affectation that we've got of performative emotion, and that being a substitute for actual action or actual political achievement. Taking the knee is a very good example. You're seeing all these people doing this, and you're saying, well, what about in your business, making sure you promote people on merit? What about the way you talk about people when you see them on the street? What about the way you interact with people? What about the decisions you make financially? What about, this is actually what matters. And I don't like, and by the way, it's not just on this issue, but on lots of issues, the modern view of I'm going to do a symbol, and that symbol alone demonstrates my virtue. I think that is really, really unhelpful. I don't think it's useful. I actually think it's divisive without achieving any practical aim. And if you look in the past, now look, I wouldn't term myself an activist, but if you look at activism in the past, it was real action. And you talk about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King didn't just, he didn't do the equivalent of take the knee. Martin Luther King did concrete things in furtherance of what he believed in. He had real political skills and managed to coalesce a group of otherwise disparate people in the pursuit of a shared goal. I think in modern politics, so much of what we do just seems to be, and I use this phrase only very, very gently, virtue signaling. We perform to show our virtue rather than actually doing something. And for me, that's the wrong way around.
What about tearing down statues then? How do you feel about that?
It's another version of it, but in some ways it's more pernicious because, now look, you've got to decide periodically whether you're going to keep a statue up, replace it with something else, because obviously you can't, I know they're literally frozen, but you can't freeze these things forever. But the idea that you should take down a statue of anybody, for example, connected with the British Empire is completely balmy. First of all, the British Empire had many aspects to it. Secondly, in fact, this country were the people who abolished slavery first, which I think was the most damaging aspects of the British Empire. And also, rightly or wrongly, it's a huge part of our history. And you're not going to have many statesmen, or frankly, anybody involved in politics from the time of, 1750 through till 1950, unless you include people who were involved with the British Empire. In their own time, these people need to be judged in their merits in their own time. And I think that tearing down statues in that regard is not helpful at all.
Okay, well, let's talk a bit more broadly now about your politics. So you're Prime Minister, don't forget, and you can make an argument for your politics and your policy. So, in your first speech, I'm not asking you to write a whole speech from scratch right now, but what would you kind of say to sum up what you stand for? I mean, how would you describe your politics in a couple of sentences?
I think there are really two main things that I'm very committed to. The first is allowing politics should allow as many people as possible to achieve human flourishing. And what I mean by that is not happiness in the way that we often think about things in today, but flourishing. That means fulfilling your potential. That means being able to go as far as you can, not just in financial or professional ways, but also socially. That means you should be able to live the life you want to live. That means you should be able to have the family that you want to have, live in the sorts of communities that you want to be able to live in. And so I think that allowing that human flourishing, and that encompasses economic questions, educational questions, social questions, integration questions, I think is sort of foundational to my politics. And the second thing, and this is more of a day-to-day political question, but I think it is important, is we really need to try and come together over some shared goals for the country. Whether it be the challenge of automation, whether it be how to manage the rise of China, whether it be, there are so many big questions, how we deal with an aging society, how we deal with generational inequality. These sorts of questions cannot be solved just from winning an election and whipping through pieces of legislation. In order to solve these problems, you actually need to get a broader set of people in the country, in civil society, in business, in politics, behind what you're trying to do and actually deliver it. What are examples of when we've done that? I think that over devolution, for example, though, by the way, I'm not a fan of how devolution was implemented. I want to make that quite clear. But the truth is, when devolution was implemented, there was a broad consensus across the UK of that was needed at that time, and it got done. And it has endured, as I say, for better or ill. That's the sort of politics we need now more than ever, I think.
And you talk about people flourishing, and of course you are an aide now at the Department for Work and Pensions, and there's a big question at the moment about universal credit and whether removing the £20 uplift that was put in place during the pandemic would allow people to flourish, or whether it would push people into poverty. How would you defend removing it? I mean, you just can't, can you?
Well, at a time when you've got when people aren't allowed to work in many areas because we all know of the restrictions put in place, I think we are going to have to do something. Now, I'm not theological about the £20 uplift in and of itself. I think that actually what we need to be doing, and that, by the way, there isn't nearly enough of this, either within the Conservative Party or outside it, in the Labour Party or wherever, is to think, what is the right level? What is the right level of universal credit? To what way, people think it broadly has performed well during the pandemic. Okay. So in what ways do we need to improve it? What's the right level of it? How should that be tapered so that we can make sure that people work their way out of poverty so that they aren't facing artificial barriers to work? How do we keep improving that? And that's how we've got to think about it. I think that, yes, of course, it's a political decision around the 20 quid uplift and to retain it and for how long for and all the rest of it. But actually, we need to be thinking more foundationally about what is the right level and have that debate, because I think that debate is the really important one over the medium term. Because if we retain the £20, that's fine. But if that isn't the right level, then surely we should be aiming for the right level. So for me, that's what the debate should be focused on. I know that in government people are thinking about this, but of course it's very difficult when you've got politics, hammering away at you. And of course, you've got the budget coming up in March and say, look, you've got to make some decisions. But I just hope that the government finds the space to have the proper debate around what is the right level of support for people who are going through tough times, or indeed are working but don't have enough money to live on.
I take your point that obviously there needs to be a long-term view of all of this, but I suppose for lots of people who've had the £20, they're thinking about the immediate term and they're worried about potentially losing that £20. It sounds to me as though you're quite clear-headed that you will have to do something to sort of maintain that uplift or replace it maybe with £1,000 payout, whatever it might be.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to have to do something. But under something is a huge multitude of different options. What I do know is that there is a the decision was made last year for us to have to wait and see what the economic and COVID situation was. And if we think back, around October, November, when this was coming up first as an issue, and I'm sure the time when you were maybe starting to cover it and think about it yourself, October, November, the COVID situation was quite different to today. The vaccines were not in place yet. The infection rates were actually relatively low. And imagine a decision that had been made then for March now would look quite odd. So I think that the Chancellor and the Work and Pension Secretary and the Prime Minister were right to say at that time, let's wait into the new year to really assess where we are. Obviously, now we're coming up to the end of February, we're in that decision point. And I think that decision point is going to be in the next few weeks.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the union too, because you mentioned it in terms of devolution, and that is going to be a huge issue for the current Prime Minister and for you in your role as Prime Minister right now. I mean, do you worry that this
I love that you're persisting with this, I'm Prime Minister.
I mean, it's the whole point of the podcast, so we do like to flog it. But what is it about devolution that you think has not worked out well?
Broadly speaking, you cannot have a stable polity if revenue is so divorced from political responsibility. Because in essence, what it allows one part of the polity to do is it allows that polity to blame every single problem on the central government by virtue of the fact that they have the purse strings. The reason why this is complicated, of course, is we have different parts of the country are richer than other parts. London and the South East is one of the richest regions in Europe. I think it's one of the 2 or 3 richest regions in Europe. The Northeast, for example, or Northern Ireland is much poorer than that. So you're going to need some element of fiscal transfer from the centre to different regions of the country, but you have to do that at the same time as allowing where you have devolution. I mentioned Northern Ireland, but it's the case of Scotland as well. And Scotland in economic terms is sort of in between London South East and Northern Ireland North East. There's a balance to be struck. So in my view, we need to clarify much more the powers between Westminster and devolved governments in Holyrood and in Wales, and indeed in Belfast. So first of all, it's clarify. Secondly, it is ensure that the devolved regions do raise more of their own revenue for areas that they're responsible for. And thirdly, for the UK to be a much more visible and active presence in the different parts of the United Kingdom. And I don't just mean, putting up, when there's a bridge being built or a road being resurfaced, sticking the Union Jack on it, though, those things are important. I actually think it's to actively intervene in policy and to direct. So the internal market bill I was a strong supporter of, largely for the reason that it clarified and made very clear that the United Kingdom can spend money in every single aspect, every single part of the United Kingdom, notwithstanding the political views of any devolved government. I think that we need to be much clearer about that, and people need to understand much more effectively that if you live in a part of the UK that has devolution and a relatively high amount of devolution, for example, in not so much the regions of England, but in terms of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, there is a point to being part of the UK, because the problem with many people who've argued for more and more devolution, and their answer to political problems in the union is just more and more devolution, is you don't solve this fundamental problem. So we need to actually enable the UK government to do more in the whole United Kingdom, make sure that different regions have more responsibility for raising their own funds, but of course to make sure that the centre supports them, because the centre obviously have resources that the regional governments do not have, and to be really, really clear about those things and those responsibilities.
Do you think this is a year of great peril for the union? Is that something that worries you?
Hugely. I can say there was a discussion amongst Conservative MPs on different subjects recently, just sort of a virtual get-together. And look, people have different hobby horses, people have different ideas about different things. I'd say more than half of the questions overall in an hour were about the union. So it's not just me. This is something that I think the Conservative Party cares about. Frankly, speaking to people in my constituency, friends, family members, etc., I think the country as a whole is thinking about, because unless we can just bring back some stability to this question, it's going to be hard to move forward on all our other shared aims and all the political things that people like you and I spend all our time thinking about and worrying about. If your constitutional framework is not solid, then I think that's really, really going to undermine that.
Okay, well, look, we're almost out of time here, Bim, so I need to do my quickfire round, which I always like to finish off with. Who would you rather have dinner with, Margaret Thatcher or Theresa May?
Margaret Thatcher.
Okay. Where would you go on holiday as Prime Minister? Not that you can at the moment.
Not that I can. Where would I holiday?
Have you got a favourite destination?
Probably go to Bali.
Nice. What song would you dance to at party conference?
A song by David Guetta that I probably shouldn't mention on the podcast, but yeah, it's very, very good.
Which song? We can always bleep it if it's a rude one.
Yeah, it's "Sexy Chick" by David Guetta. Quality piece of music.
That's amazing. I'd love to see people dance to that at a party conference. What would your Downing Street pet be?
My wife would maybe get a dog.
Okay. Yeah, a dog's a good one, I think. It's very sort of statesman-like to have a dog.
Yeah, exactly. No, my wife would make me definitely get a dog.
And the question I ask everyone at the end, would you actually want to be Prime Minister?
The political gods are much more akin to the Greek or Roman gods than to the God of the New Testament, I think it's fair to say. So I don't think it'll ever happen. But I think that it would be such a unique and interesting challenge being Prime Minister. And I think being in politics, you like interesting and unique challenges, right? So
There's a little hint there.
I just think if you're in this business of politics, you've got to want to do interesting, complex, challenging stuff. And I do that every day. And I'm really, really lucky to be able to do that because I love what I do. And if I was in the position where people thought that I would do a good job at that, then I would do it if people thought I would.
Oh, well, we'll look out for you in the future. But we are out of time. Bim Afolami, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to speak to you.
No problem. Thank you.